What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and welcome to another Getting Started in 40k video. Today, we're going to be talking about building an Adeptus Custodes army and building it up from a combat patrol up through a standard strike force game. I'm going to be talking about units you can take, tactics to use, and a guide to purchase your models to make the best use of your hobby dollars. In the canon of Warhammer 40,000, the Adeptus Custodes are the elite guards of the Emperor and other Imperial elites. They are marvels of genetic engineering, eclipsing even the impressive Adeptus Astartes, and are individually both intelligent artisans as well as superlative warriors, equipped with some of the most powerful weapons the Imperium has access to, and clad in the most advanced armored systems that the Empire can provide. On the tabletop, this makes Adeptus Custodes into an elite but highly effective army. One of the benefits of this army is that you will not have to be dealing with too many models. They are easy to collect, not too difficult to paint up, and as such are a pretty popular starting place for many new players. That said, the army is difficult to play. Each individual custodian is relatively slow. However, each of them is a powerhouse in their own right. The downside is that you'll have very few units and models in the army, and losing even a single custodian too early can spell the difference between victory or defeat. The faction does have lots of teleportation and movement buffs to help with their small footprint and slow movement, but it's important to keep in mind that when playing Adeptus Custodes, you'll have to play your models very deliberately, because mispositioning them can spell disaster. The army ability of the Adeptus Custodes is the Martial Kata. This allows you to buff your units when engaged in melee with a Kata stance that will provide them either additional hits through the sustained hits effect that will give them an additional hit on a critical hit roll, or easier wounds with lethal hits being automatic wounds on a critical wound roll. You get to choose this for each unit in your army that is engaged in melee when they're selected to fight, and knowing the proper time to choose each kata stance is very important. Generally speaking, if your unit is wounding on 5s or worse and doesn't have any rerolls baked in, many of the units in the codex that we're going to be discussing momentarily do have a lot of wound rerolls, so generally speaking, lethal hits is less effective for those. But if you don't have any wound rerolls and you are wounding on 5s or 6s, choosing lethal hits is typically better. In other situations, choosing sustained hits to get more hits is typically preferred. Now let's move over and talk about starting the faction in a combat patrol. Combat patrol is the pre-constructed mode to play Warhammer 40,000. Each faction has one or more combat patrol options, and they give you basically a fully complete army list that you can play at small point sizes in order to get a feel for the game. And I recommend that new players who are just getting started in 40k start with this mode. Adeptus Custodes actually has 2 combat patrols, but the one that we're going to be choosing to use for this one is Tristrian's Gilded Blades. This is an extremely straightforward combat patrol that's easy to use and has many useful units that you'll get a lot of use out of as you collect the faction. Now, interestingly, the Custodes combat patrol is actually too large to fit within the confines of a combat patrol game size, and this actually makes Adeptus Custodes fairly easy to collect, because you won't have to purchase that many additional models in order to build yourself out into a Incursion or Strike Force list. In fact, the Tristrian's Gilded Blade Combat Patrol encourages you to take unit sizes that are actually too small for games using the standard 40k army construction rules. However, the additional models do come in the box, so you're basically getting additional value for your money in terms of the points value of this boxed set. So with that, let's talk about moving into an Incursion list using this combat patrol. Now, Incursion is the 1,000 point level, and at this level, we start to make use of 40k's standard list building rules, and that requires that we choose a detachment. Now, the detachment that I recommend that you start with is the Shield Host detachment. This detachment is very straightforward, and while it lacks in a lot of the tricks and tactical flexibility that other custodian detachments bring along with them, it makes up for that in raw damage output. The Shield Host detachment ability allows you to choose one of 2 effects at the start of each battle round. One of them improves the critical hits of your Martial Kata performing units to a 5+. This means that they will trigger whatever the Martial Kata effect you choose for that unit twice as often as they would normally. So if you were to choose to take the sustained hit stance with a unit performing a Martial Kata while this Martial Mastery ability is active, they would trigger additional hits from sustained hits on both 5s and 6s. The other option is that you can improve the armor penetration characteristic of your melee weapons by 1. Now, I've crunched some math to give you some basic basic rules on when to choose each of these abilities during a standard game. It's important to do a little bit of mental math before each game and at the start of each battle round, and consider what your units are likely to be in melee with during that battle round. If the stuff that you're likely to be fighting is relatively low toughness and you're going to need the additional hits from sustained hits, choose +1 AP if you're in a situation where it will matter. If your opponent has a strong invulnerable save, or they don't have a very good armor save, and the AP2 on most of your melee weapons are going to punch right clean through that, you won't obviously need extra AP there, and so you're better off taking the additional critical hits. But in situations where, for example, you're fighting Space Marines that just have a 3+ armor save, and the additional AP will put your AP2 melee weapons up to AP3, that is going to get you the most value. However, if you are in a situation where you're trying to get lethal hits, where your units are going to have to be wounding on 5s without any modifiers, getting the improved critical hits so you get twice as many lethal hits is going to be better. But which martial mastery ability to choose and when is going to be an important consideration that you'll learn while playing this detachment. Now, to the Combat Patrol box, I've added 3 additional purchases. The first 2 are pretty simple. These are Anathema Psychana Witch Seekers. These are Sisters of Silence, which are anti-psyker support units that you can take alongside Adeptus Custodes. They come right from the faction and they benefit from most of your faction abilities, although there are some stuff that specifically don't affect Anathema Psychana units, so that's something to keep in mind when you're reading through your abilities. These Witch Seekers are scouts and forward operators with flamethrowers, so they'll fulfill multiple roles inside a Custodian army. First of all, they're good at clearing light infantry, which is something the Custodes don't really want to be worrying about too much. Custodians are extremely good in melee. Each of them provide a very powerful melee attack, but they don't have too many ranged attacks, and especially they don't have very high volume ranged attacks. So outside of these Alaris Custodians that we'll discuss in a moment, the Custodes don't really want to be shooting at screens or guardsman equivalent units in order to kill them. And the Witch Seekers have a high volume auto-hitting weapon that is going to be perfect in this role. They also have scouts, and they can act as forward operators and hold objectives and perform secondary actions, which is incredibly useful for a faction where most of your army wants to be pushing up the table and engaging with the enemy. So we have 2 units of those. We're going to be taking the minimum unit size in each of those, 4 models apiece, and these come in their own little boxed sets, and I think that you can find some pretty solid stand-ins elsewhere around the range or on the internet. We've also included a transport for one or both of these units, an Anathema Psychana Rhino. This is essentially just a standard Rhino chassis with upside. It is a light APC, but it's relatively difficult to kill for very cheap, and if we put a unit of Witch Seekers inside it, their scout ability is actually going to confer to the transport, since it is a dedicated transport, so the Rhino is actually going to get to scout up the table in the early game as well. This makes it a really good objective holder all by itself. You have this resilient body that's very inexpensive that can sit on an objective and hang out for a while. Altogether, this little package can solve a lot of your scenario issues that Adeptus Custodes will typically have, and they're going to be useful in basically regardless of what game size you play. Now with that, let's talk about the actual Custodians themselves. This is basically going to be comprised of the contents of the Combat Patrol almost exclusively. We have a Blade Champion in here. This guy is a absolute melee powerhouse, and we're going to attach him into a unit of 5 Custodian Wardens. Now 5 Custodian Wardens come in the box, and we're going to use the entire box in order to make the most efficient use of our purchases, but oftentimes you'll see Custodian units played with only 4 models in competitive lists, so there is a little bit of list optimization as you learn to play the faction a little bit better. But in this case, the 5 Custodian Wardens are going to do us just fine, and they're going to be ridiculously resilient. The downside of Custodes, as I mentioned before, is that oftentimes they're very slow and cumbersome to move around the table because they have a relatively mediocre movement characteristic, and they can't really take too many transports. There are transports that can carry around Custodes in them, but the downside is that they're incredibly expensive. The Blade Champion solves that problem, however. He gives you a once per game ability where you can advance and then charge with your unit. So he allows them a burst of speed once per game, and the Wardens are particularly synergistic with that because they also have a once per game ability that makes them incredibly hard to kill. So this means that either if your opponent gives you something to charge, you can advance and charge up the table, kill it, and then become resilient to kill during the next phase, or on the other hand, you can use them to stage up in the middle of the table, even potentially just expose them to your opponent and use their ridiculously strong defensive stats to tank a bunch of damage before then using their burst of speed to get deep into the heart of the enemy army. On the flip side, however, we have the Custodian Guard. This is a battle line unit, and While they don't have the same level of resilience as the Custodian Wardens, they don't have the Warden's bodyguard -1 to be wounded effect, and they also don't have their once per game use of a Feel No Pain. However, what they do have is wound rerolls, especially when targeting enemies on objectives. This makes this unit relatively good at shooting, because they can also use their Sentinel Storm to double attack once per game, so that you can use them to clear a little bit of infantry if you have the opportunity to do so, which is especially effective if they're benefiting from those wound rerolls. But they also just hit way harder than the Custodian Guard once they're stuck in, and if they're benefiting those rerolls. This is the unit that you almost always want to be taking sustained hits on during your Martial Kata, because their wound rolls are so effective from the get-go that you don't really want to be getting too many lethal hits. Last, and certainly not least, we also have an Alaris Shield Captain, as well as a unit of 2 Alaris Terminators. Now, these guys are going to be kind of your infantry clearers for the army. As I mentioned before, one thing that Custodians can get hung up on are little infantry units that move up and move block their units or screen out their deep strikes, and the Alaris Custodians have a pretty good opportunity to just blow those guys out. If the unit they're attacking is a monster, vehicle, or character, they get wound rerolls against it. So especially against large infantry units that have characters inside them, these guys go absolutely crazy. But they also just have a blast grenade launcher weapon with an AP value, as well as their Guardian Spear, and they can shoot both weapons at the same time. So the full unit of 3 has 3d6 blast attacks plus the Guardian Spears that may be rerolling their wound rolls. We also have equipped the Shield Captain inside the unit with the Panoptis specs. This is an enhancement that gives his unit ignore cover, which is very good for these relatively low armor penetration anti-infantry weapons. Now, the Alaris Custodians are really interesting. They have the ability to redeploy themselves once per game, so once they're on the battlefield, they can actually deep strike somewhere else. And I think it's important to note that all of the Custodian infantry can deep strike just innately. This means that it's usually pretty useful to use units like Custodian Guards in Deep Strike, and then use the Rapid Ingress stratagem to bring them in on the table during your opponent's turn, so that you can then move and attack the opposing army on the subsequent turn. And the Alaris Custodians can do this even better, because the Shield Captain gives them a once per round CP cost reduction. The other benefit that these high attack volume units like both the Alaris Custodians and the Custodian Guard have is the Archaeotech munitions stratagem inside Shield Host. This can give you either sustained or lethal hits on your ranged attacks. And so when we're talking about this unit that's firing a bunch of blast weapons and Guardian Spear shots, or this unit that's firing their weapons twice, thanks to that Sentinel Storm, getting either one of those effects on these guys is going to be pretty good, especially when we're attacking smaller infantry units. Now, once we're talking about getting into melee with enemies, basically any of the Custodian units themselves, the Wardens, the Guard, or the Alaris Custodians, are going to be incredibly effective at knocking down big targets. So the Blade Champion with his special weapon profile certainly helps the Custodian Wardens punch above their weight class. So while they don't normally have the same level of damage output as the Guard or the Terminators, the Blade Champion can help out there. But if you can get a situation where either the Terminators or the Custodian Guard get their wound rerolls activated, the massive number of relatively high strength, high AP, and 2 damage attacks from them is good at killing basically any target. Custodian units are some of the most dangerous units in the game in melee against basically a wide variety of enemies. Now, when discussing playing this army, I think the mastery of a couple specific strategies is really going to help you out quite a bit. The first one is this concept of staging. One thing that you typically want to be doing with Custodian units is getting them up the table as far as you can without them being in line of sight. Your opponent will take every opportunity they can to pump heavy anti-tank weapons or anti-infantry killing weapons into your units before they get into melee to try to mitigate their damage output. So trying to get your units into positions on the table where they can be threatening, maybe even hold down objectives, but aren't necessarily in line of sight, is going to be the most effective. For example, if we had this Blade Champion Warden unit here, they could be holding this objective, but with their advance and charge, they could reasonably be threatening this entire area of the battlefield. So while your opponent can't really interact with them because they don't really have a good opportunity to shoot them, anything that's in this area that's moving up to try to threaten this objective is going to be in danger of those Wardens coming out and attacking them. The other thing that Custodians use almost exclusively to get themselves up the table is the Rapid Ingress stratagem and Deep Strike effects. As I mentioned before, all the Custodian infantry, the Wardens, the Guard, and the Terminators, have Deep Strike on their datasheet, so anytime they're in reserve, they can come in 9 inches away from enemies rather than the normal 6 inches off of a table edge. And the Alaris Custodians use this particularly effectively. As I mentioned before, we can use Rapid Ingress to come in after our opponent's movement phase. So if, for example, our opponent has moved up into a position where they're threatening some lines of fire potentially, or they're threatening control of an objective, we can use rapid ingress to place these Terminators in a position where the enemy doesn't have line of sight to them, but where it's going to be an easy charge for the Terminators to come back in and attack the next turn. And we can do that for free thanks to the Shield Captain's once per round CP cost reduction. Now, Adeptus Custodes probably use this mechanic more than almost any other faction in the entire game, and as we move on to the Strike Force game mode, we're going to be talking about it quite a bit more. So keep rapid ingress in mind. The biggest benefit is that it allows your units to then move in your movement phase rather than just coming in 9 inches away from enemies by themselves. So it essentially turns what would normally be a 9-inch charge out of Deep Strike into what is effectively a 4-inch charge, because now you can jump in out of Deep Strike and then move. The thing that you have to keep in mind is that it's important that you either keep yourself out of your opponent's line of sight when you do it, or you give them only lines of sight with things that either want to be attacking somewhere else or don't have the attack volume to kill the Custodians. Now, the Witch Seekers and using the Scout abilities is also going to be important. As I mentioned before, the Witch Seekers will actually contribute Scout to their Rhino, which means that the Rhino is going to get a 6-inch pregame move in addition to the Witch Seekers getting that pregame move. This can be used for a bunch of different things. You can move them to get up close and personal with your opponent and try to hold down objectives or contest objectives early on in the game, or they can use it to protect themselves if you don't end up taking the first turn. So being able to put these units into a position where your opponent can't see them, even if your opponent goes first, means that you're never going to be losing these useful utility units early. This is especially nice on this Rhino because it allows the Rhino to then potentially move up and just act as an objective holder itself, and then disembark your additional Witch Seekers in order to go actually shoot at enemy infantry units or perform attacks themselves. I think an important thing to note about the Witch Seekers as well is that they can force battle shock checks on enemies, which is a pretty useful ability, especially if you were talking about something like the Space Marines here and they have defensive stratagems like Armor of Contempt. Potentially preventing them from using Armor of Contempt is a big deal for these Witch Seekers, and sometimes it can switch up a game, although it's not particularly reliable. I wouldn't expect it to do much, but it can sometimes alter your opponent's game plan in a big way. Now with that, let's talk about graduating this army up to the Strike Force game size. This is the standard size for Warhammer 40k games. It's 2,000 points, so twice as big as the Incursion game level, but it is the standard competitive mode for 40k, and it's the mode that the game is typically balanced around, at least for competitive play. Now obviously with Custodes units being relatively expensive individually, we've only added a couple things to the army. The first one is we've duplicated the Warden unit and the Blade Champion. This is kind of the bread and butter of a lot of Custodian armies, and so many of them will be taking 2 or sometimes even 3 instances of this unit. The Custodian Guard base attack profile doesn't really need that much help to be very effective against a wide variety of targets. You have a lot of attacks, you have potentially sustained hits to clear infantry, you have high strength, high AP, high damage to clear vehicles, and potentially lethal hits as well, and then the Blade Champion helps out with that. So the Wardens being difficult to kill and the Blade Champion making them fast basically shore up all of the other weaknesses that a unit like the Custodian Guard will have. And then we've also added some resin units. Now, I'm kind of remiss to encourage players to buy into the Forge World resin because it's expensive and it's a little difficult to work with if you are a brand new player to modeling. But the truth of the matter is that the Custodes range is very limited if you're only using the plastic options. And especially if you're trying to play competitively, it's very, very difficult to get useful Custodian builds out of only the plastic kits. Units like these Caladius Grav tanks that we have in here are simply easier to use, and I think you're going to get a lot more mileage out of them if you are a newer player. As a bit of a side note, though, we could replace the Caladius Grav tanks in this build with a Land Raider if we wanted to. It's not nearly as good of an anti-tank option as the Grav tanks are. However, it can transport the Custodian Guard around, so that's something at least. In this case, we've added 2 Caladius Grav tanks. These ones have their Arachnus Blaze cannons on them. This makes them some of the best anti-tank shooting in the entire game. So while the Custodian Guard shooting in and of itself is not particularly solid, they are pretty good at killing like maybe Space Marine equivalents, kind of 2 wound infantry in okay numbers, but they don't have too many attacks outside of the once per turn Custodian Guard attack. What they don't really have inside the faction almost at all is anti-tank shooting, and the Caladius Grav tanks shore up that weakness pretty effectively. That allows you to actually compete with enemies that have the heavy armor penetrating weapons that can kill Custodians reliably. And if they're moving out to attack your custodians, the Caladian Grav tanks can come back and kill them. We've also added a unit of 3 Venatari custodians. These are jump infantry, and they have a unique interaction with rapid ingress. I talked previously about how powerful rapid ingress is to get your deep striking units into melee, and the Venatari custodians are able to rapid ingress not only for free, but also do so even if other units have also rapid ingress at the same time. So what this allows you to do as a Custodes player is play a lot of units in reserve and then rapid ingress multiple of them at the end of your opponent's turn to essentially get around the low speed of your custodian models. Now, when it comes to playing this army, understanding these reserve mechanics, as well as understanding when to use the Warden's once per game really powerful Feel No Pain, is basically the crux of the strategy. Now, as you see in this instance, I've actually elected to put a lot of the army in reserve. We can put up to 50% of the points value of the army in strategic reserve, and that's what we're going to be trying to do here, and then making use of that rapid ingress to get use out of these units. We've also put a Caladius Grav tank in reserve. One thing that I think it's important to talk about with these guys is that they are relatively resilient, but especially for their cost, they will go down to concentrated fire, and ensuring that you can use them when your opponent has their heaviest vehicles exposed is going to be the most important thing with them. So I would actually encourage you, unless you have a really good target for your Caladius Grav tank, and if your opponent has long-range anti-tank, basically just keep them out of line of sight and try to preserve them for as long as possible to punish your opponent for coming in with their own heavy vehicles. For that reason, we also even have a Caladius Grav tank in reserve, and these guys are great out of reserve because they can come in off a table edge and they can get really clean lines of sight down around the sides of the table. If your opponent has screens and is trying to prevent you from coming in those areas, units like the Alaris Custodians can help us clear those out. But that will allow us, when our opponent comes out with their own heavy tanks, to try to shoot at our Custodian Wardens or our other vehicles, to come in off a table edge and ensure that we have a line of sight to those guys so that we can punish them with the really, really, really powerful Blaze Cannon shots. Now with that, I think we're typically going to see both of the Custodian Warden units placed on the battlefield. The reason for this is, as we discussed in the previous section, the ability of the Blade Champion with his once per game advance and charge to kind of threaten a lot of real estate is really impressive. Even if this unit is just sort of pushing up into this area, their threat range engulfs almost this entire center of the table. And the unit is so lethal that most enemies aren't going to want to even risk having 6 Custodian Wardens come in and engage them. So oftentimes, unless they have movement blockers and unless they have ways to prevent this unit from moving very quickly, they're just going to try to stay away from you with their most valuable units. So you can use them to kind of absorb table space. Now, an important thing to keep in mind is when to use their 4+ Feel No Pain ability. It is declared at the beginning of a phase, so you have to consider before your opponent basically makes any decisions whether or not you want to use that effect. And oftentimes, it's pretty obvious. When your opponent sets up a bunch of models that can see the Custodian Warden unit, and it looks like they're going to be shooting at that Custodian Warden unit, then you want to be declaring the use of that ability. But it's also important not to get in your own head about it. It is pretty easy to try to mind game your opponent out and hold the use of this ability for as long as possible, but if in that case your opponent just is generating additional damage to you, you essentially want to be using it the turn before you get into melee, ideally. If your opponent's staying outside of the unit's threat range and keeping their units far back, you can use it as a once per game, essentially the ability to run up into the center of the table, blank a bunch of their incoming damage, and then use that to get the unit springboarded up into the fight. So assuming that we are moving up into this aggressive position, threatening the center of the table, we can use our 4+ Feel No Pain that turn in order to bounce a bunch of our opponent's attacks on it. And if they come in to try to attack it, the Warden unit's just going to charge them. If they don't move up to attack the Warden unit, you either don't need to use the ability because it's declared at the start of the shooting phase, or the fight phase if they're coming in to try to melee you, or you're just going to retain control of this objective, which is nice. Now, the other thing to keep a note on is that when you are setting up to use this ability to protect the Wardens, it's important that your opponent doesn't have other good units to shoot. So for example, if we were in a situation where we had the Custodian Guard taking an objective and fighting an enemy unit, and our opponent could line up to attack either the Custodian Guard or the Wardens, if the Wardens use their ability, all of those attacks are just almost automatically going to go into the Custodian Guard. So it's much less effective. You want to kind of force your opponent into a situation where they have to declare attacks onto the Warden unit. and then fight through that feel no pain, because you're going to be taking essentially half damage from all incoming attacks. So in the early game, while you still have this ability active, essentially all you want to do is make sure that the only thing your opponents can see to attack are wardens that could use that ability. So even if this is both warden units moving out at the same time and both using the ability in order to move really, really aggressively and move really super far forward, that's pretty useful. Or if you're putting one unit in harm's way and it's a warden unit that's using that ability, and then you're going to run those guys somewhere else and then use this other warden unit to come out and then use that ability again, that also works very effectively too. But what you don't want to do is expose the wardens, use their ability, but then also give your opponent a lot of other juicy things to kill, and then your opponent's just going to choose to kill those, and you're not really going to get that much benefit from it. Now, the other really important tactic that's going to be vital for playing this army is, again, that rapid ingress stratagem. I can't really emphasize too much how important rapid ingress is to the Custodian game plan. First things first, the Venatari Custodians, as I mentioned before, can duplicate the rapid ingress stratagem even if you've used it on a different unit. They must do so second. So essentially what you're going to do is during your opponent's turn, you're going to say, I would like you put my Custodian guard down using rapid ingress, putting them in a position where your opponent doesn't have line of sight to them, but with a 6-inch move and then a charge, they can get into some juicy targets. Then you're going to say, I'm going to use my Venatari Custodians, and they're going to do the same thing somewhere else, either on a different flank in the opponent's back line, or even just supporting the unit that already came in. The Venatari Custodians are also much faster than the other Custodians. They're move 10 instead of move 6 with that jump pack, so they can navigate a little bit more effectively around the table. It's much easier to get them in a position where they can hide behind a ruin or behind a piece of terrain with that 10-inch movement, and then move them into a position where they can charge onto an objective, into a ruin, or somewhere relatively scary for the other player. It's also important to note that the Alaris Custodians will have their redeployment ability. So at the end of the opponent's turn, they're able to go back into strategic reserve. So what they can do is they can rapid ingress, move out, attack, shoot an enemy unit, kill something. If they survive the subsequent turn, which is fairly likely because they're a difficult to kill unit, and as long as you don't put them right in the front of the opponent's army, they probably won't have all of their attacks able to bring the bear onto the unit. If any of the Alaris Terminators survive, they can then at the end of the opponent's turn go back into reserve, and if you want to, you can either then bring them back on the subsequent turn during your turn, or you can actually use rapid ingress again on the opponent's future turn. So for example, let's say that they come in on round 2 and they kill something. Then at the end of your opponent's turn 2, they go back into reserve. You can go through a whole nother battle round, and then on your opponent's turn 3, rapid ingress them back in, move them and attack again and kill something else. So keeping in mind these redeployment abilities and the ability of these units to come in at the end of your opponent's turn is a huge deal. It's also important to keep in mind that it's also important to have a plan to kill your opponent's screening units. The Witch Seekers can help us out a little bit, especially if your opponent doesn't have a good save. The Custodian Wardens have good enough shooting that they can kill a couple of infantry models, and the Custodian Guard or the Alaris Custodians especially are pretty good at killing infantry at range. So bringing those guys in early, if your opponent has a lot of infantry units that are coming in to try to stop you from getting good deep strikes or good charges on them, and blowing out those infantry units to allow your heavier hitting units to get into melee is going to be a really important tactic to keep in mind. So with that is playing Adeptus Custodes through the Strike Force game mode. There are many ways to expand this Strike Force army into other compositions. As I mentioned before, we were kind of using as many of the Custodian models that we got in these kits as possible, but that does mean that the units may be a little bit suboptimal. You can play 4 Custodians instead of 5 in a unit and save yourself 50 or so points per unit. And oftentimes that is enough firepower to kill whatever you need to. So a lot of armies will actually play units of 4 Custodians, and that gives you a lot of additional points to play with, getting additional characters in, or even entire additional Custodian units. So playing around with your unit counts and optimizing your units can get you some more useful units into your army. There are also plenty of additional Imperial agents that are played often in Custodians to make up for the fact that they're kind of a low model count army. There are smaller units and characters characters that can operate as utility units, as well as things like Imperial Assassins that can give you more deep striking and more utility. Oftentimes, characters like Kyria Draxus are used in addition to the Custodian Guards. Because the Custodian Guards are battle line, they can actually be led by Imperial Agent characters like Inquisitors. So Kyria Draxus is particularly good because she has really powerful ranged attacks that benefit from the unit's rerolls when they're on an objective, and can also be super devastating when using Sentinel Storm to attack with the unit twice. So she's very commonly played inside these Custodian armies. She's a little complicated, so I didn't put her in this particular build, but definitely once you have a couple of games under your belt, that's definitely a place to look. Inside the Shield Host detachment, you can also play with units like Virtus Praetors. These are especially useful if you don't want to go down the route of playing Callidius Grav Tanks. They're very fast and very hard hitting and have some interesting movement effects, and are particularly strong in Shield Host because getting additional hits with sustained hits on them is super strong. I will say though that being mounted units, they are a little difficult to play, so bear in mind that there is going to be a bit of a learning curve to those units, which is why I didn't come out the gate recommending that you start with them. However, if you want to play the more infantry focused game plan, you can also do that in basically all of the other Custodian detachments. The Talons of the Emperor especially is another really good one that doesn't have the same level of damage output as Shield Host, but it has a lot more tricks and tactical abilities, so you can do things like fall back and charge, reactive move in response to your opponents, improve the strength of your ranged attacks, which are all super useful. In addition, if you want to play more vehicle focused and focus on Dreadnoughts and the Callidius Grav Tanks, you can swap into Solar Spearhead as well. Those Dreadnoughts kind of compound the low model count aspect of Adeptus Custodes, and the infantry focused game plans are definitely the classic way to play the faction, but the Solar Spearheads that focus on vehicles are nonetheless very powerful, especially once you have a couple games in with the more infantry focused varieties of the faction. So there's plenty of ways to play Adeptus Custodes, and the power of their individual datasheets definitely makes it fun to experiment with a lot of them. So if you have a particular way that you like to play the faction, let me know down in the comment section, and let me know what faction you think I should cover next on this series. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. If you want to support my video creation, you can do so either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise. You can join my YouTube channel membership down in the link below the video, or subscribe to me over on Twitch, where I live stream all of my 40k games. And if you're looking for places to play, especially online on Tabletop Simulator, you can join my Discord in the link tree down in the video description. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.